Okay, so in this last video from Module 1, I'm going to go over how to set up image planes and how to add the reference images that you create to those image planes to use as your guide for modeling, and then how to create, arrange, move, rotate, and scale primitives to match the basic shapes depicted in the reference images of your prop. But before I create these planes for the image planes, I want to go over Maya's snapping tools. Snapping allows you to snap objects and elements to other objects, elements, and aspects of the interface and your scene. The snapping buttons are up on the menu bar. Starting from left to right, snap to grids, snap to curves, and snap to points. And those are really the three you're going to use in this project. These buttons also correspond to the X, C, and V keys on your keyboard. And it's a good idea to try to get in the habit of using the hotkeys instead of the buttons. Because if you use the buttons, you'll have to remember to turn them off. And sometimes that can get frustrating when you're trying to move something in your scene and you've forgotten to turn off one of these snapping buttons. But you can see as I hold down the X key on my keyboard that the snap to grid points button is depressed. When I hold down C, the snap to curves button is depressed. And when I hold down V, the snap to points button is depressed. So starting with the snap to curves button, with that on, I can snap to any grid point. So starting with the snap to grids button, if I hold down the X key, I can snap to any grid point in any axis, or I can grid snap to two axes at a time, any two axes, or all three at the same time. For snap to curves, I'll have to create a curve quickly just so you can see this work. If I hold down C for curve snap, I can snap the sphere along the curve. And for snap to points, I'll duplicate my sphere. If I hold down V for point snap, I can point snap the first sphere to any vertex on the second sphere. Okay, so now I'm going to create some planes to set up these image planes. I can create objects a number of different ways in Maya. I can go to the Create menu, Polygon Primitives, Plane. I can also use the Plane button on the Poly Modeling shelf. And when you create primitives in Maya, you have two options. You can either have interactive completion turned on or turned off. I tend to keep interactive completion turned off, but I'll show you what it looks like when it's on. So under Polygon Primitives or NURBS Primitives, whatever you're creating, there's an option at the bottom of the submenu to turn on interactive completion. So with that on, I could create a plane with grid snap and snap it to the grid points. When interactive completion is turned off, pressing the plane button will create a plane in the middle of the grid based on the current settings. Now on Maya, the settings are contained in the option boxes. So if I go back to my Create Polygon Primitives menu, you can see that to the right of each of these options, there's a box. And that box will bring up the options for each of those operations. So by default, the plane has a width of 1, a height of 1, and has 10 divisions in each direction. So if I wanted to change these settings, I could make this 1 and 1, because that's what I'm going to be using for these image planes, because the only thing these image planes are doing is displaying the reference images so I can model from them, so there's no reason to have any more divisions in either direction than 1. If I wanted to keep these settings to use for every time I press that Create Plane button or go to the Create Polygon Primitives plane, I can save the settings here in the Polygon Plane options. And that will make sure that every time I use the button or the menu operation, it creates the plane with these settings. So you can see now when I press this button, with interactive completion off, it creates a plane in the middle of the grid that has a length and width of 1 and 1 division in each direction. Now when you model in Maya, by default, something called the construction history is turned on. The button for that is behind one of these show hide icon buttons that we talked about. It's right here. And by default, the construction history is turned on. And that means that everything I create will contain the input that was used in the creation of it. That's this one here that I can see on the channel box. And under that input, I could change the number of subdivisions in each direction after creation, or the height and the width. If I were to turn this off and create another plane, you can see that this plane doesn't have that input node. And when you model in Maya, everything I do to this plane, whether I extrude, add an edge loop, delete an edge loop, delete a face, all of those inputs will be stored on the model if that construction history is turned on. So at some point, those nodes can build up on a model and can start to give you problems. So it's important to understand when you want to have construction history on and when you don't want to have it on. I'm going to keep it on for this entire project because we're not doing anything that's terribly complex. If you're creating a really high resolution character model, for example, you would want to keep that history in check. When you get to a stage where you're satisfied with the state of the model, you can select the model, go to the edit menu, and delete by type its history. And that will get rid of all of those inputs at that stage. But I'm going to leave this turned on, and I'll just hide those icons again. I'm going to scale this plane up, so I want to scale it in all three axes at the same time, so I'll just middle mouse drag on the box in the middle. And I'll name this headphones top image plane. To create the other image planes, I'm going to duplicate this first one that I created. And duplicating in Maya is performed with Control D, that's the hotkey. It's also under the edit menu, duplicate, and that will simply create a straight copy of the plane. So this new plane, which is called headphones top image plane 1 by default, and I would change the name of this to front image plane. This duplicated plane has no connection to the original. So to create the other image planes, I'm going to duplicate this first one that I created. And duplicating in Maya is performed with Control D, that's the hotkey. It's also under the edit menu, duplicate. And that will simply create a straight copy of the plane. So this new plane, which is called headphones top image plane 1 by default, and I would change the name of this to front image plane. This duplicated plane has no connection to the original. So if I were to take this image plane and scale it, it has no connection to that original. You have a couple of other options when you're duplicating in Maya that you can get to from the Duplicate Special option box. I could create an instance copy instead, and that instance copy has a one-to-one connection between the original. So anything I do to the copy So if I were to right click and choose a vertex on this So if I were to take this image plane, move it aside, select one of its vertices, and move it, you'll see it has no effect on the original. Same thing is true in the other direction. If I were to move one of the vertices on the original, you'll see it has no effect on the copy. There are some other options when duplicating as well. If I go back to my edit menu and open the Duplicate Special option box, if I were to change the geometry type from copy to instance and create a copy, move that copy aside, and do the same thing, select one of the vertices, you'll see that when I move this vertex, it affects the original. And that would work in the other direction as well. If I were to move a vertex on the original, it would affect the copy. So that's the difference between copies and instances. So I want this front image plane to be standing upright so that I can see it in this front camera. So I want to rotate it from its bottom. But right now the pivot point is centered to the pivot point is at the center of the object, which also has to be at the center, which also happens to be in the center of the grid. To change the pivot point for an object in Maya, you simply press Insert on your keyboard and then move the manipulator. And you'll see that when I hit Insert, my manipulator changes from the Move tool or whatever tool I had selected at the time, to what's called the Universal Manipulator tool. And this is essentially the combination of the Move, Rotate, and Scale tool all in one. So with Insert, after pressing Insert, I can hold down the V key I can hold down the V key, which is the hotkey for point snap again, and drag the pivot point down to the bottom of this plane. Pressing insert again will get you out of pivot mode. And now I can rotate this plane up so that it's standing upright. And I'd want to type in exactly 90 in the x-axis. And then I'm going to point snap this, and then I'm going to grid snap this back to the center. So X for grid snap, and drag it back to the center. So now I'm seeing this image plane, this front image plane, in my front camera. So I'm going to duplicate it one more time, again just with Control D, and I'll rename this to side, and I'll rename this to side image plane, and this time I'm going to rotate it so that I can see it in my right camera. So this time it will be 90 degrees in Y. So I now have 3 image planes set up: the top, the front, and the side. So I'm going to save this file because I wouldn't want to lose this work. So save scene as. It'll bring me right into my GRA 202 Final Project Maya scenes file. I'll name this headphones image planes. So now I want to add the reference images to these planes as materials. There are numerous ways to create and edit materials in Maya, and we'll get to some of these later on in the and we'll get to some of them later on in the texturing tutorial. And we'll get to them later on in the shading and texturing tutorial. But the quickest way is the right mouse button. And as I mentioned earlier, the right mouse button in Maya is your best friend. It's almost always the fastest way to access anything you want to do with any particular object or element in your scene. So I'll go to my top image plane, select it, hold down my right mouse button. I'm going to assign a new material to it. And I'll choose a Lambert. And you'll see that'll bring up my attribute editor. And I can see all of the nodes associated with this image plane. And here to the right, I have something called Lambert 2. So that's a new material I just created for this particular plane. So now I want to assign an image plane to the color channel of this material. So to do that, I simply click on the checkerboard pattern to the right of the color channel. And that will bring up the Create Render Node window. I'll choose File, open up the folder button to the right of the image name field. And you can see I've already saved all of my image planes into the GRA 202 Final Project Maya source images folder. And that's where I would suggest you place your reference images as well. So I'll choose the top band image for this. Open. And you'll see that I can't see that texture applied to that plane yet in my view panel. In order to do that, I need to hit the 6 key on my keyboard. And in Maya, the 4 key on your keyboard will show you wireframe, 5 is shaded, and 6 is textured. So now I can see that that reference image is applied to that top image plane. The buttons here in the attribute editor will take you back and forth between the connections to that Lambert, or the connections between any nodes. So I'm going to name this headphones top image plane Lambert. I'm going to copy all of this so I don't have to type it over again. And now I would go through the same process for each of those image planes. Okay, so now you can see that I've set up the rest of the image planes that I created for the headphones, move them so that they intersect each other in the middle and match the configuration of the actual headphones. But I've simply gone through the same steps we just went over. Created the planes, rotated and moved them into place, assigned new materials for each of them, and then loaded the appropriate image plane to the color channel of each of those materials. I also set up image planes for the peripherals, the volume hub, the USB, the headphone jack, and the splitter. Went through the same process of duplicating the original plane, rotating and moving them into place, creating new materials, and assigning the appropriate reference images to the color channels of those materials. The last thing I want to do here for the image planes is group them. And in Maya, grouping is simply a matter of selecting the objects you want to group and pressing Ctrl G, and I'll name this Headphones Image Planes Group. Copy this so I don't have to type it over. And then group these as Peripherals Image Planes Group. And now I'll save this. Headphones Image Plane 01. Now just an important note that every view panel has its own shading menu. And through that shading menu, you can turn on something called X-ray. And that allows you to see through your objects so they become transparent, but you can still see the images that are applied to these image planes. So if I turn on shading X-ray in this view, you can see that everything becomes transparent, but I can still see the reference images on these planes. And that's going to be very important because I want to be able to see through the primitives I'm going to create and arrange, move, scale, rotate them to match the reference images. So I need to be able to see through the objects, but also see these reference images. I'm going to model the peripherals after I complete the modeling of the main headphones. That's why I moved these image planes back here. So I'm going to hide this group temporarily. And now I'll begin creating and arranging the primitives that best match the shapes depicted in these reference images. So I'm going to hide the band images to begin. And I'm going to start with this object here in the middle. Okay, so now I'm going to go about setting up some primitives for the various shapes that make up this particular prop. And the goals of this exercise are threefold. One, you're going to get comfortable creating primitives. Two, you're going to get comfortable moving, rotating, scaling those primitives, using the snap tools to move things more precisely. And then three, and maybe most importantly, you're starting to learn how to pick out the most appropriate primitive for the shapes that make up your particular object. And that's a really important skill because generally speaking, if you can begin with a primitive rather than starting a model from scratch, it's a good idea to do that because the primitives give you surface area to work with. So anytime you're working with geometric shapes that are perfect circles, perfect ellipses, right angles, those are oftentimes much easier to achieve by beginning with a primitive rather than starting the model from scratch on your own, because creating right angles and creating perfect circles or perfect ellipses is time consuming. And for this first assignment, that's all you're doing. You're creating and arranging primitives, moving them to match your reference images, select the primitive that's most appropriate for the shapes depicted in your reference images, and then setting the parameters to get you started in the best possible way for what you want to eventually do with those primitives. So the next shape I'm going to tackle is the one that makes up this outside of the cup. And I won't be able to create the entire thing with one primitive. So I'll probably create this section down here with one, and then this section up here with another. And this is another instance where there's probably a couple of choices to consider. A box might work. You could make a case for saying the cube might work, but again, it's a little bit difficult to make those rounded shapes than it is to make the right angles. So I actually think a cylinder, again, is going to be the right choice. And I'll keep this size at 16 because, again, I want to be able to cut the cup in half and mirror the other side. So I want that straight line just like we did for the first section. And then for these sections here that are the pads, these are pretty straightforward. They're essentially toruses. And on the headphones themselves, the interior of these torus areas are indented. So that's going to be easier to create with a torus than it would be with a sphere. Okay, it's going to be easier for me to set the pivot point to the back of this. I can snap it to the back of the original section. And then I'm just going to make a duplicate of this one to get the second pad. The band. To create the bend in the cube is going to take some modeling that we'll get to next time, but I would want to create a cube that is about the same length and width as that band. And I'll save this as headphones primitives. But that's the basic idea of this assignment. The goals are threefold: to get used to working with the primitives, choosing the best primitive for the shape that you're trying to represent, getting comfortable with my snapping tools, using the manipulator to move, rotate, and scale your objects in 1, 2, and 3 axes at a time, and then arranging the primitives to fit together as close as you can. So that's the basic idea of this first Maya assignment in the course.